Welcome back. South Africa's employment rate in the formal job sector has dropped by 1.2% between June and September 2024. That's according to Statistics South Africa. The quarterly employment statistics do not include formal jobs in the agricultural sector. The community services industry experienced the most significant job losses, shedding 131,000 jobs. Other sectors experiencing job losses includes the business, service, manufacturing, as well as transport and mining. Stats SA also released the retail trade sales and inflation numbers this week. Professor Miriam Altman, economist and professor of 4IR practice at the University of Johannesburg, helps us unpack these numbers and what they mean for South Africa's economy. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us. Looking at the stats that have come out, what is it that jumped at you, and how should we make sense of where South Africa finds itself currently when it comes to jobs in the formal sector?
Well, the main thing to take away is that unemployment's very high. It's, as much as it's changed by 1%, I find that not very credible in an environment where the economy's basically been stagnating or shrinking. So I suspect it's probably a little bit of a statistical anomaly. The most critical thing to know is that we have high unemployment, a very slow-growing economy, and we're not really breaking into this challenge.
Yeah, you say not credible. What is it that makes you say that? And the reason that I'm asking this is also on the basis of some of the slack that Statistics South Africa has been facing when it comes to collating data, and I wonder whether the use of that particular phrase is because of that.
I've been a little bit worried about the labor statistics in recent years. I've spoken about that before. They don't need to come out with numbers that seem credible. They need to collect effective numbers, and we need to analyze them. Having said that, it's just not very credible that suddenly in the third quarter of the year, there's been this jump of, I think it was about, it was over 100,000 jobs maybe, which is not great performance for what we need to achieve. We should be creating somewhere around 300 to 500,000 jobs a year. So it's not that it's great performance. It's just that in the context of a stagnant economy, and you're still seeing manufacturing falling, agriculture's doing poorly. I think you were referring to the quarterly labor force survey that just came out, which does cover agriculture. You may have also been referring to the quarterly employment survey, which doesn't. But generally speaking, all the sectors that are goods producing are performing very poorly in terms of output and also in terms of employment. So it doesn't bode well. So, it may be that quarterly figures show something, but it's not a particularly effective a measure of what's going on in a stagnant economy. So the real things to watch around this isn't so much even the quarterly numbers. I obviously you want to track the employment numbers, but it's really to see, will load shedding lifted? So that could have helped, except that the producing sectors aren't doing that well. So, if you had seen manufacturing jobs boosted, that type of thing, then you would see the impact of falling load shedding. Now, as you know, we've got a break on the economy related to water. On the upside, there are important interventions to start turning the municipalities around, which is absolutely critical. A restoration of revenue services that can fuel infrastructure, and hopefully public infrastructure will expand well. So we need to look at the things that mark stimulus to the economy that leads to dynamism that then creates jobs.
Yeah, I wonder with that aspect when it comes to load shedding, that we have had close to now 300 days of absolutely no load shedding, and the expectation was that we could see an uptake of economic activity, and specifically looking at the manufacturing sector. If the reason why we are seeing that there is no uptick is because of the low business confidence that we've seen, according to the South African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, South Africa's business confidence declined in September 2024, dropping 1.3 points to 110.2. Could that be one of the reasons that we are seeing this? that business and investors are being too cautious?
Well, it's surprising that it would fall in this year. Was the period over this year that you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, well, so that's quite surprising because the end of load shedding you would think would be very positive towards sentiment, but sentiment's just a result of the kinds of things that I was referring to. How well are municipalities working and metros working? What is the investment environment? Is government's infrastructure program moving so that, you're crowding in private investment? It's, are the ports turning around fast enough so that, goods can get out to export markets? Has the visa story been sorted out so that tourists are coming in and also stimulating the economy? It's not, this idea of an investment strike, firms want to invest and they want to expand. That sentiment is just dependent on these very real things. It's not an abstract thing. It's a result of what they see happening and whether they think they can move ahead. You
Yeah.
see what I mean? People raise this investment strike thing as if it's an ideological thing, and it's really just a practical story of how easy is it to invest and do firms perceive that they'll be able to get a return on their investment, and can they sell these investments to their to their shareholders, and the environment's like I said, I thought it would get better after load shedding. A whole range of things like water have come up.
Yeah, I think a lot of people perhaps maybe thought that it will get better. Even the finance minister, during the medium-term budget policy statement, revised downwards South Africa's growth prospects. The IMF as well has said that South Africa's economy is likely to grow by just 1%. And all of that is a big issue because on the one end you have the population that is growing, but then also the level of unemployment is also increasing at the same time. And as I always stress, that these are still warm bodies, these are still people, human beings who need to use some of the facilities and some of the services that you're referring to, including water.
Yeah. So, unemployment itself is a damper on growth and on the stimulus, because people aren't spending money, they're not earning money, they don't have that kind of dynamism in the economy. So, just to give you an idea of the context, over the past 10 years, in 2014, in the third quarter, unemployment was just under 5 million people were unemployed, and now it's around 8. We might have created 1.5 million jobs maybe over that period. So, there's about 16.9 million people working. It's really not a good situation. So you can split hairs over what happens in a quarter and whether it's correct or not. But at 1% growth, it just stands to reason as a macroeconomic constraint that employment over time will grow in relation to economic growth. There's a very close relationship between them. For every 1% GDP growth, employment grows by about 0.6%, which is actually quite high by global standards. So, if the economy is growing by 1%, you do the math, whatever happens in a quarter, there just isn't the space. So people sometimes say, well, growth doesn't matter. Growth matters a lot, any kind of growth actually, but would make a difference at this point. But 1% just means we're going backwards actually, because the population's growing faster than that. So we're actually going backwards when it's 1%. And all of that relies on, there was a lot of destruction of capacity in the state, and that in turn destroyed capacity in the private sector. And we've really got to be moving fast on rebuilding and have a high commitment to rebuilding these institutions. Now, you are starting to see that in the state, so that's a positive thing. So, for example, the turnaround processes in the metros, as an example, that Treasury's been driving, and core services. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on that we can be happy about, but we got to move and be more aligned around it.
Yeah, and you need the speed around that as well. If you look at the governments of national unity, the discussions that have been taking place so far, and even from an ideological perspective, ask yourself whether or not the two main parties in the governments of national unity will be able to find each other to decide on what our economic policy should look like in terms of the trajectory that we require for the country. But there's a different understanding also of what that conduit could be to build the economy. Is that a problem for the country?
You know, we've got to focus on basics right now. We tend to fight about stuff that's kind of on the side. We sort of reach to stuff that might not be in hand to do right now. And we forget that the key things are probably making sure that technical education improves, that young people come through the education system into education opportunities after school and get fed into work, that firms can export pretty fluidly through and more value-adding kinds of manufacturers can get their goods through ports, that electricity is available, that water is available. Because, you know, investments can't be approved without water. You know, so I've been speaking, I'm working in the area of water security right now and speaking to heads of the metros about whether that's an investment constraint, and they're absolutely clear that it is.
Yeah.
So, you know, these are just basics, and we sometimes get caught up in all kinds of ideological sideshow kinds of things. And, you know, we really have to hunker down and focus on rebuilding the capacity of the state and the alignment with the private sector to enable investment and growth. And that requires an enablement of the population. So within that, you know, that's also stuff like, you know, making sure that passenger transport is working so people can affordably get to work, you know, on time, that, you know, that life is functional for people. Because, you know, with this amount of crisis in people's lives, it's very hard to function well. People sit on a precipice constantly. There's so much stress in people's lives. So we really need to focus on, you know, really on basics that really would drive growth. And like I say, we're often just getting pulled apart on stuff that's really a sideshow.